Earlier this month, protests broke out in Bolivia. Originally triggered by a law affecting land mortgage rules, the protests quickly spiraled out into a wider anti-government movement, with protesters demanding the resignation of incumbent President Rodrigo Paz, who took office less than a year ago. We're now nearly 3 weeks into the protests, and things are showing no sign of calming down. Protesters have blockaded roads into Bolivia's administrative capital of La Paz, and on Tuesday, the Bolivian Congress voted to allow the president to declare a state of emergency and deploy the military. So in this video, we're going to take a look at Bolivia's political crisis and how it might resolve. Russia once liked to think of itself as a major regional player. Perhaps it still does. But with resources depleting and attention still focused on Ukraine, the country's broader sphere of influence is shrinking. So, in the latest issue of our magazine, we unpack how Russia's influence in their sphere is slipping away. That's just some of 80 pages in the magazine though, because there's more to too long than you'd expect. Purchase your copy by clicking the link in the description. So to understand where these protests are coming from, you need to know a bit about Bolivian politics. In short, between 2006 and 2019, Bolivia was ruled by a left-wing socialist party called Movimiento al Socialismo, or MAS, who won an outright majority in the 2005 election, the first single-party majority since Bolivia's return to democracy in 1982. During this time, MAS was led by a guy called Evo Morales, who served as Bolivia's president. During its time in power, MAS implemented a series of really quite left-wing policies. These included more protections and autonomy for Bolivia's indigenous community, with Morales being Bolivia's first indigenous president, a dramatic expansion of the Bolivian welfare state, and a sweeping renationalization program. This program of renationalization covered the national telephone company, electricity firms, parts of the mining sector, and, perhaps most notably, Bolivia's gas industry. For context, Bolivia has some of South America's largest gas reserves, but the gas industry was privatized in the 90s. In 2006, Morales sent the military to occupy Bolivia's gas fields and gave foreign investors a 6-month deadline to hand majority control over to Bolivia's state-owned gas company, or up sticks and leave. In the end, most foreign investors decided to renegotiate their contracts, allowing the state to capture a dramatically larger share of gas and oil revenues without triggering a sudden decline in production. Oil and gas revenues more than doubled overnight and continued to rise over Morales' first term, both because Bolivian production increased and because global energy prices were pretty high. This money was then used to fund the aforementioned expansion of Bolivia's welfare state. The percentage of Bolivians living in poverty fell from 59.9% in 2006 to 34.6% in 2017, with extreme poverty more than halving from 38.3% to 15.2% over the same period. The Bolivian economy boomed on high commodity prices, with GDP growth averaging about 5% between 2006 and 2019. Increased export revenues from gas and other commodities like gold, zinc and silver allowed Morales' government to run successive budget surpluses between 2006 and 2013, and Bolivia's debt-to-GDP ratio fell from a high of 85% in 2003 to a low of just 30% in 2011. However, as gas production stagnated and global commodity prices fell in the 2010s, things started going downhill. Growth slowed, Bolivia started running large deficits, and Morales' approval ratings started falling. Morales reacted by becoming increasingly authoritarian, and he essentially ignored Bolivia's constitutional term limits in order to contest the 2019 election, despite having recently lost a referendum on exactly this question. The preliminary results suggested that Morales won the 2019 election, and by a wide enough margin to avoid a second-round runoff. However, a sudden and unexplained pause in the counting, on top of the fact that Morales' run was already constitutionally dubious, provoked widespread protests, and, after the army and police requested he resign, Morales did exactly that, although he simultaneously claimed to be the victim of a coup. Interestingly, at the time, there was a pretty widespread consensus that Morales did indeed rig the election, especially after the Organization of American States, or OAS, claimed that their audit had found widespread irregularities and evidence of vote manipulation. Today, however, expert opinion has shifted. Further analysis has shown that the OAS overstated the magnitude of the irregularities, and that much of the late swing in Morales' favour towards the end of the count was merely a consequence of the fact that votes from rural areas, where Morales was especially popular, take longer to come in. This isn't to say that Morales acted as a perfect statesman. His run was probably unconstitutional in the first place, but it's also true that, in retrospect, it does look like he was pushed out by the Bolivian security services. This would also explain why MAS dominated in the subsequent snap election in 2020, after Morales had been replaced by his former finance minister Luis Arce. However, the new MAS government was almost immediately plunged into crisis. COVID hit the Bolivian economy hard, and persistent declines in gas production and exports meant that Bolivia was unable to benefit from the high energy prices that followed. From the sidelines, Morales accused Arce of mishandling the crisis and tried to retake control of the party. This triggered a split within MAS, and the subsequent infighting effectively incapacitated the government. With Bolivia's debt burden spiraling out of control, inflation skyrocketing, and widespread shortages of essential goods, MAS essentially withdrew from the 2025 election, knowing that they'd get hammered whoever they were led by. The election was duly won by Senator Rodrigo Paz of the Christian Democratic Party, a more right-wing politician who promised to fix Bolivia by implementing pro-market reforms. Paz's first big policy came in December, when he abolished fuel subsidies. This was maybe necessary from a fiscal perspective, but it was incredibly unpopular and caused fuel prices to almost double overnight. Things got even worse with the war in Iran and the subsequent disruption to global energy supplies, which caused widespread shortages. The final straw was apparently a land reform law passed last month that was supposed to basically allow small farms to use their land as collateral to get loans, but was perceived by indigenous groups and rural Bolivians as a way to open up their land to bank seizure. This triggered the protests that we've seen over the past month or so. The protests have been spearheaded by Bolivian workers' unions, but Paz and his government believe they're actually being coordinated by Morales himself, who is currently holed up in his political stronghold in Cochabamba, having been issued with an arrest warrant earlier this year for allegedly trafficking a 15-year-old girl. This is the second time that Bolivian authorities have issued an arrest warrant for Morales, but they've been unable to actually arrest him because he's literally surrounded by his supporters, mostly from indigenous communities, who have blocked any attempt by the Bolivian security services. So what happens next? Well, in recent days, Paz has taken a markedly more aggressive tone, declaring a state of emergency and warning Morales that, quote, justice is coming. This makes some strategic sense, given the relatively conciliatory approach he attempted originally has apparently failed to placate the protesters, but it means that tensions are likely to escalate in the near future, especially if global oil prices don't come down. The latest issue of our magazine, Too Long, is out now, and if you want our best value ever, subscribing and using the code SUMMER26 gets you your first copy for as cheap as £4.99, as well as 20% off as long as you stay subscribed. I actually told you about one of the articles in this edition of the magazine at the start of this video, but this issue's also jam-packed with other content from all around the world. Obviously, the headline section is our rundown of Trump's wars around the world, discussing all of the different countries and regions which have faced Trump's military wrath, going nation by nation through the timeline, and reaching the ultimate question, has Trump launched a modern holy war? From there, we dive into our regional sections, starting with the UK, where we unpack the results of the recent May elections, take a look at the UK's odd foreign posture, and discuss whether Britain has become ungovernable. Then in the EU section, we discuss how Russia's sphere of influence is fading, why Europe's energy transition isn't what you expect, and also look at the Euro's missing members. Finally, in the global section, we discuss if we're seeing echoes of the First World War, what's next for Iran, as well as what really came from the Gen Z protests we saw emerging last year. But that's not even everything. With this 80-page issue, our joint longest ever, there's even more to read than I've even been able to mention here. So click the link in the description to learn more and grab your copy of Too Long today.